Well, welcome to our channel. If you are brand new to questioning Christianity, our real heartbeat is to help connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. And in this conversation series, our hope is to invite onto the channel experts who really know what they're talking about, to pick up on the questions that matter and the questions that you keep asking us. And in today's episode of our QC Conversations, I'm delighted to have an old friend back on the channel, Dr. Sharon, who is no stranger, having come on for a previous episode, but to pick up on her new book called Broken Planet, with a subtitle that basically lays out the theme for this conversation, for this episode. If there's a God, then why are there natural disasters and diseases? That's a huge question, so I'm glad to be throwing it someone else's way, and we're going to invite on Sharon. It's great to have you on the channel again.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for having me. It's really great to be here.
No worries. Would you be able to actually show us a physical copy of your book? Because I love the artwork. Over here in Australia, put it just in front of your face. That'd be awesome. But yeah, over here in Australia, it hasn't yet arrived on our shores. You were super kind to send me through the advanced copy. But Broken Planet, if there's a God, then why are there natural disasters and diseases? That's available now for everyone on all platforms. And the reason why it's really worth getting will unfold across this episode. But Sharon, we had you on last year on a very different theme to talk about the whole mind, brain, body paradox, the questions around how do we make sense of our consciousness and rationality and sense of freedom from your last book, Am I Just My Brain? And a bit of your background for the maybe audience that hasn't seen you in that episode before. You did your PhD in brain imaging at Cambridge University and spent time as a scientist studying how the brain works, and hence the sort of experience to write your previous book. So curious, what led to writing a book like this, to spend so much time, energy researching stories of natural diseases and suffering and disasters around the world? Curious as to what drove that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I guess that suffering is the hardest question of all, and it's the experience that comes to all of us one way or another, be that through our experience of our own encounter with suffering, illness and suffering in that way, or through kind of, human brokenness and so on. And I actually wrote an earlier book called Why. So prior to Am I Just My Brain, my first book was on the more general subject of suffering, dealing with it in a general sense. And I had one chapter on natural disasters, but I came to realize that at the heart of this most difficult question of all, there's an even more difficult kernel, which is, why is there seemingly brokenness within nature itself? And why would God allow a world that contains that brokenness? And so I decided, and there are obviously so many different kinds of suffering and so many different kinds of natural disaster and disease. And so I decided to examine many of those different kinds of disasters, such as earthquakes, tsunamis, locust infestations, wildfires, pandemics, and so on, volcanic eruptions. And so I took each of those in turn and wanted to look more closely at this question.
Yeah, I remember when you contacted me in the summer of 2019, 2020 here on Australian shores, where we had that huge wildfires that just devastated so much, and doing some of the sort of research phase for this book back then. I'm like, I can't wait for it to come out. And I think one of the unique features reading through the advanced copy that you sent to me kindly was the fact that you just include personal stories at the end of each chapter. And you kind of covered a lot of ground. I mean, there was the 2004 tsunami that happened on Boxing Day that hit Southeast Asia. You had the 2010 earthquake over in Haiti that just wreaked huge amounts of devastation. You had volcanic eruptions from a couple of different major island features around the world. You had the wildfires in Australia, and then the COVID-19 pandemic, hurricanes. It was very extensive in that regard. I'm curious, why did you think that personal stories actually were really important in helping people to wrestle with this question of suffering?
Yeah, I think that people connect with stories. And I think stories are often the thing that people remember. And I think they connect with argument, but they can also connect with narrative. And, I didn't include them as a kind of an add-on to highlight or buffer the apologetic arguments. I actually see the stories as being an apologetic in and of themselves, a kind of living testimony, written account of how somebody can walk through extraordinary disaster but still hold on to belief in a loving God.
Mm.
Um, and I think that speaks so powerfully alongside the arguments that are drawing from kind of science and geophysics and philosophy and theology. I think just these actual gritty stories that engage with the reality of life on the ground in a disaster are just so helpful. And the people that contribute their stories are the real heroes of this book. There were many that I interviewed that their stories weren't able to go in the book for various reasons. But they are truly heroic in the work that they do and the things that they've seen and endured. And it was a privilege to interview them.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, some of the stories are harrowing, and I want to maybe help people that were potentially pick up your book. They're not stories that are tied up in a neat bow either. A lot of them are just left with grief and uncertainty and mystery and wonder and questions. And I think that was a real value add as well. This book isn't an attempt to make sense of everything, but just to give us some resources and stories to probe different dimensions to the question. And maybe shifting
Absolutely.
to some definitions from personal stories to technical philosophical definitions. You mentioned before that the problem of evil, or the problem of pain or suffering has these different kernels to it. And often philosophers will break it up into the concept of moral evil, or the evil and then suffering we experience at the hands of evil that's done by moral agents, be they human or otherwise. But then you've got this category of natural evils, which many of the normal explanations or theodicies don't really speak to. Could you spell out what exactly is meant by that term or phrase, natural evils?
Yes. Well, often when we are responding to the question of suffering, as you said, we often find ourselves giving a free will defense to say that people can be cruel to each other, and that's partly how we account for why there is so much suffering in the world. But an earthquake seems to happen in spite of our actions, not because of them. These events seem to happen because of forces outside of our control. And so, what is it that is in nature that accounts for that? And I guess theologians and philosophers would argue that there's a sense of brokenness embedded in the natural world that brings about suffering, and that is referred to as natural evil. Or it could also be something that's embedded in our very biology that brings about disease and sickness and the suffering that comes from that.
Like, it's an interesting phrase, though. Yeah, the things that happen to us at the mercy of nature that maybe seem somewhat outside of human control or influence. But it seems odd to me that we use the phrase natural evils in the sense that it almost smuggles in a sense that what happens to us is wrong. That this is not the way that things should be. And I'm curious whether you see that intuition that I know a lot of people I've spoken to in this area have experienced. Why is this happening? This seems wrong. The train of the world is off its tracks. Do you think that intuition in some way could be a soft evidence for the Christian story and how it offers an account of how these things came to be?
Absolutely. And of course, you're absolutely right that not everyone would give it the name of evil, because actually many people would say that this is just the way the world is, particularly those that don't necessarily believe in God. If you don't believe in God, then how do we make sense of these things that happen in the natural world? Well, we look to scientific explanations that tell us about the forces of nature, and virology, about how viruses are very good at replicating, and the human immune system can explain why some people are more resilient than others, and all kinds of scientific explanations that actually are extremely helpful and elegant, but they essentially point to the fact that nature simply is the way it is. There isn't anything particularly right or wrong about it. It just does what it does. And so this is just the way the world is. And that's helpful to a degree, but it doesn't actually provide a means for us to make sense of our anger or bitterness or rawness or deep hurt at what has happened to us or what we see happening to other people. And as you pointed out earlier, to call something a disaster is or evil is to say that there's something wrong with the world, that we indeed do live on a broken planet that seems to have incredible beauty and goodness, but also is very broken and chaotic in some ways. And when we call something wrong and when we rail against the suffering that we see, it's as though we're implying that there are kind of moral standards that sit outside of our own preference, that sit outside of the cultural context that we happen to be in. And so, how do we make sense of that? How do we make sense of that kind of moral judgment on the world, on a situation? And of course, there are a number of people today that would say that, well, objective moral values simply exist as facts. They would be the objective moral realists that are having an increasing voice, that these things just are facts that are here. But is that the way that we can best make sense of our morality? Or is there a more persuasive explanation that says, look, we make moral judgments all the time. We are morally sentient beings because we have always lived in a moral universe that has been moral right from the beginning because it's been set into being by a good God. And for me, I'm more persuaded by that view. And for that reason, our inclination to call something a disaster or that it's wrong is a pointer towards the existence of God, not away from him.
Yeah, I found that interesting when I started diving into the problem of evil, because it was a big part of my own story. My mum is obviously had significant brain damage from a car accident in my youth, and just thinking through, why do I feel like this is not the way things should be, that there's a wrongness to this situation, there's an oughtness to how the world should operate. And I had to wrestle with that intuition myself, and where does that sort of stem from? So I found the Christian story offers layers of explanation that I found were missing in other stories, which is kind of helpful. Obviously the big question, I think, as many people would be flicking open a book, Broken Planet, Why Does God Allow These Things, is why does God allow these sorts of natural evils? And one thing I found mildly frustrating, but a stroke of brilliance on your part, is that you don't dive straight into answering that in chapter 2 or chapter 3 or chapter 4, but instead you start pulling together all these other layers of explanation that people need to take into account. Things like the necessity of some of these natural disasters and the way that our Earth functions in order to be able to foster and sustain life on our planet that we may not consider. And so do you want to spell out a little bit more what you mean and some of these features of fine-tuning, in a sense, that are necessary for our planet to include, but that may result in there being natural disasters?
Absolutely. So an earthquake happens because of tectonic activity, tectonic plates kind of moving up against each other. In the 60s, the geologists discovered that the Earth isn't one fixed, rigid plate, but a number of plates that are in motion against each other. And there are boundaries where one boundary comes up against another is where you are likely to have seismic activity. And this activity of plates rubbing against each other actually recycles nutrients from deep beneath the earth back to the surface. And often you find a volcano quite near to a boundary between plates, and that is a means by which those nutrients are released back into the atmosphere. And so, big picture, some of this activity has a role in sustaining life on Earth by creating and recycling nutrients. Also, even something
the
like
ground more fertile, and I was reading the comment where even the creation of mountain ranges through this sort of seismic activity then is what is used to water and irrigate other parts of the world. As you know, the mountain systems collect water that then filter down into rivers that water huge parts that before they're able to make it out to the oceans. And you think, wow, it's what creates fertility on so much of the earth, as well as this kind of seismic activity, which seems rare, this tectonic structure, even in other exoplanets that we're aware of, another feature of that's necessary for the sustaining of life on our planet.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
So I found that
of
really
course,
interesting feature as sort of one layer of explanation. Oh, maybe this is necessary if we want to set up a system that can sustain life in that way. One response though that I was thinking about as I was reading that section, because I'm like, that's a feature I haven't really considered that much. But why wouldn't God supernaturally replenish these nutrients, right? If we're
Yeah.
talking the potential that God could create the best of all possible worlds, the sort of conversation that was taking place between Leibniz and between Voltaire and stuff way back in the 18th century and stuff. Why is it necessary that God does it this way? Why couldn't God create a world where he supernaturally or through miracle or creative events constantly replenishes the nutrients? Do you think that there's some feature at why, if God's going to do
Mm.
that in the future, there will not be a broken planet, but a new heavens and a new earth that
Mm.
will be restored? Why don't didn't God
Yes.
just create that world first rather than
Yeah.
this one with the experiences that we have?
Yes. I mean, I think this is where we get into kind of mental
Speculation.
gymnastics of trying
Yeah.
to imagine other possible worlds that this world could have been, and future worlds as well that we think. But the first thing I do want to say about the future of our planet is that God doesn't say that we will float off to heaven to a ghostly, floaty existence, but
Yeah.
he says
No.
that heaven will come to earth. And so that will mean that the laws of nature that are on earth at the moment probably will continue to be. There may be new laws added, who knows? Maybe we'll be able to fly at the speed of light, who knows? But it does speak of a new heaven and a new earth,
Mm.
which implies that there may well be elements of this earth that remain, but additional laws and elements are
Mm.
added. So that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be replaced, but just augmented, and that's a
Yeah.
thought in and of itself.
Yeah.
But just to come back to the heart of your question, um, for God to be intervening supernaturally, I think would actually, I don't know, I think it would, uh, well, that where do you draw the line? If God is kind of choosing to intervene supernaturally to stop this particular law of nature from doing its thing, then
Mm.
where does that stop? And how would God then decide, I'm going to intervene here but not here? And of course, you think, well, maybe just go with the really big disasters, but
Yeah. Right.
who?
Yeah.
I mean, who knows? But
Yeah.
it does become harder and harder, and it does become. It could end up being an imposition on our free will, and I come to this later when we talk about the natural law view. That one of the reasons that there are stable laws of nature is so that we can reliably exercise our free will. Because if
Mm.
if this glass of water that I'm holding here didn't lift when I used my muscle to lift it, if the law of gravity suddenly changed and I couldn't kind of pour it into my mouth, then to what extent can I choose to have a drink of water?
Mm.
The laws of nature are there partly in order for stability in the natural world, by which science and medicine can proceed, but also so that as humans we can exercise free will within that world and be
Mm.
the free agents that God has gifted us to be.
Yeah, I found it
Um,
interesting that you made comment as well about the difference when you read the book of Genesis, for instance, and you see the God hovering over the chaotic waters after initial creation, and then goes about bringing forward a process of order and framing things and putting them in their rightful places and cultivating a garden in Eden and setting humanity as his image in there to be the gardeners and governors of the world. But you make this wonderful distinction that when that's described as good by God, or even very good upon the creation of humanity, that it doesn't say it's perfect. And in fact, the notion of cultivating a garden in Eden, something that's tended and with great care, versus the wild world beyond the borders, the very world that humanity is told to spread out, subdue, and rule over, it implies that there is something somewhat still chaotic, an order that needs to be brought about or cultivated as humanity frames beauty throughout the rest of the planet. That was sort of the original creational mandate. So I think there's dimensions to that of God's initial design and the freedom that you said to fulfill our purpose, that then having made those choices in this life, here and now, and getting to know the sort of limits and needs of our reliance upon God, that will prepare us for the task to come in the new creation in a way that couldn't have otherwise. So there's really interesting features that you draw out in the book that is worth checking out there. Common
Yes.
then in
And
the
I think, but also on that question, Dan, I think that, you can't, there's the argument that you can't have one without the other as well, in the sense that if you're creating a world with tectonic plate movement, you simply can't have that without the possibility of a hazard as well. That none of this is a threat to God's omnipotence. It's simply that there are things that if you have one, it makes a certain outcome also more likely. Just like you can't create water without having the possibility of drowning. At the same
Yeah.
time, you can't create
And
DNA without the possibility.
the
Yeah.
interesting questions that raises, like just in terms of pure speculation, will be, will we have a renewed relationship with the environment? So, the curse in Genesis 3, thorns and thistles, we're now at odds with our environment, susceptible to suffering and sickness and death and decay. And you draw out how, in some of these natural disasters, it seems like animals have a much clearer sense of what's coming, and so are able to retreat to safety, whereas human beings sadly don't have that same precognition or
Yes.
instinct to remove themselves from those
Yes.
scenarios, and that often results in us being in dangerous places at the wrong time. And so there's interesting
Yes.
features there, or whether we will, the imagery in the book of Revelation speaks of there being no more sea. And so even the structure of our planet, or what the new heavens and new earth will look like, whether that'll be radically different from the natural laws now
Yeah.
imposed upon the world that we experience. So there's so many potential questions there. One of the big features that is saddening and maybe troubling is that in the aftermath of so many natural disasters, it's common to have people both ask, where is God? Or is this a judgment of God? As well as to have often self-proclaimed prophets or religious leaders come out and say, yes, this horrendous event is God's judgment because of X, and fill in the blank with a certain kind of greed or injustice or sin or something like this. What's your take on whether natural disasters represent judgments from God, and what does the Christian story sort of feed in helping to analyze that question?
I think that it is extremely unhelpful to hear these kind of interpretations of a disaster coming through again and again in the media. I think it adds a layer of suffering to people who are already in turmoil. I think that, to imply that, and of course, I want to say in a minute that there's obviously a history to this, and I want to get to that. But at the outset of the question, the seemingly indiscriminate way in which a natural disaster hits means that when that kind of statement or spiritual interpretation of judgment comes, is incredibly insensitive. That there are always, young babies within a few weeks of life, having only just been born and haven't had any time to contribute anything damaging or hurtful to the world. Are we talking about a God that is punishing them for the sins or wrongdoing of other adults? That is not the God that I see in the Bible at all. I do want to acknowledge and recognize that in the Old Testament, in the time before Jesus, God's interaction with his people was related to physicality and geography and location. And some of the way in which his interaction with his people was meted out was in terms of their physicality and geography. And we do see some of his kind of interaction being by means of kind of natural disasters or cataclysmic events sometimes. But with the arrival of Jesus, actually the interaction of God with people shifts from being geographical and physical to actually being within every human being and centered around devotion to Jesus Christ. And therefore, I don't believe the same kinds of interpretation can be extrapolated into the present day. I think there is a distinction that we need to be very, very clear about. We can also see that there are the way that Jesus refers to anything that comes close to a natural disaster in his time. It is very much steering away from any notion of certain people being more to blame than others. In Luke 13, there's an account of a tower that falls on a number of people. We don't know whether it's just due to it was just poorly built or whether there was an earthquake that caused it to
Yeah.
fall. But people were implying that those that died are more sinful than others. And Jesus says that's not the case, essentially. And he says, but unless you repent, you too will perish. In other words, the occurrence of a natural disaster ought to cause us to focus inwardly to ask, what is my spiritual state? Where do I stand with God? Do I know where I am going if it all ended for me tomorrow or today, rather than looking outwards to pronounce judgment on other people?
Mm. Yeah. And I think of the man born blind, similarly in John chapter 9, Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus just subverts that sense of it being a karmic narrative, that you get what you deserve, and speaks at least of the notion of a broken planet, that things are more complex in a world that is not, that we're not rightly relating to anymore, that there is some kind of frustration, there is a curse, there is labor pains, this is not God's end game for where he wants things to be. And so just grappling with that realization that sometimes there is no direct line between what happens and then an active judgment of God. Often this is just part of living in a broken world, broken planet.
Yes.
So really appreciate that. Do you reckon there's dimensions that we don't consider as well about how our human agency does contribute to our experience of things like disease or natural disaster, that contributes to the problem?
Absolutely. And I think one of the points that I try to make in the book is that there really is no such thing as a purely natural disaster that is purely due to the forces of nature and nothing else. In fact, what we see is that humans have a knack of making natural disasters and the suffering that comes from it so much worse. And we only need to look at the earthquake in Turkey and Syria to see this. I think we're up to over 50,000 people that have died. And it need not be that so many people die in an earthquake of that magnitude, and so many have died because the buildings have not been built to withstand earthquakes, and corners have been cut in building
Yeah.
to avoid needing to put steel frames into them.
Yeah.
And so there are all kinds of other instances as well of like in hurricanes where shelters haven't been built or evacuation procedures haven't been heeded or communications are broken down because there's just no infrastructure to allow notice and advance warning to get out. All kinds of reasons why humans make natural disasters so much worse than they need be, or volcanic eruptions where people have ignored the coughing and spluttering and have died as a result.
Yeah.
And and so there is no such thing as a purely natural disaster. Another area that we would look at that plays into this is poverty. It is usually people living in poverty that are unduly impacted by natural disaster. We could even look at something like Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. It was the people living in much lower income houses that were the greatest affected and unable to leave the region in their car and so
Yeah.
on. That's an example from the global north. We could look at many examples in the global south that people in poverty are always worse off when flooding hits, when a hurricane strikes, when locusts come through, and so on. And of course, we can't ignore the impact of climate change, which many, and possibly, it's a kind of foregone conclusion today that human lifestyle has played into the rising of Earth's temperature due to carbon emissions and
Yeah.
so on. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, that comment that should you see sea levels rising even just half a meter to a meter, again, it will largely be those who are poorer that are going to be worst affected as they live in fishing villages and
Yeah,
seagoing areas. So, yeah. Yeah, I
yeah.
appreciate that factor. And I think
And
that's
so
one of the things
this is,
I appreciated about your book is you just spend so much time, maybe the first 2/3 of the book, just wandering through different features that play into this question that most people don't consider, but just jump to the why God sort of question without realizing the complexities of setting up a system with free human agents and a nature that needs to sustain life in all of its systems. So I'm curious though, like in some of the stories that you told, people were speaking about prayer and about crying out to God, and some of those prayers not being answered, but also a sense that for some of the stories they felt their prayers were answered. And certainly within the Christian community globally, you would have a whole host of stories where people feel like they were delivered from natural disaster or even healed from deadly diseases. And that raises another painful question for a lot of people who didn't see that same result, didn't have their prayers answered, felt divine silence or absence instead. Why don't you think God intervenes more often? If he does save some from these situations, why don't you think he saves more or all?
I mean, I think, again, we're into things that are just so hard to respond to. I would kind of want to say that it's kind of tied up with what we've just talked about, that if actually humans did their work properly on these other issues, then he wouldn't need to intervene so often because fewer people would actually die and suffer as a result. But um, I think that it is very hard to answer that question. It's very easy to kind of say, here's in general why God does and doesn't intervene, but why he didn't intervene more in this situation and less in this one is hard. Is hard to answer, to know the kind of the heart of God. What we do know is that God is good and he cares about the people that he has made, and he has intervened in human history in the person of Jesus Christ, who has come to be with us, not just to give us information about how to cope with a disaster, but he has come into human history to come alongside us in the gritty reality of our suffering. And actually, the basis for humanitarian aid really finds its roots in the incarnation, that actually God intervenes through the hands and feet of other people, of those that go to help those in need, people like those that share their stories in Broken Planet,
Yeah.
um, that actually give time and energy to go to those whose lives have been devastated, doctors who've worked round the clock, nurses who've worked round the clock during the pandemic, treating the sick, delivering vaccinations, and so on. These are all the intervention of God in our broken world. Sometimes he intervenes directly, sometimes he intervenes indirectly, but we do commend to people of God that cares about the people he has made, so much so that he was willing to become one and to walk the streets of our broken planet and do something about the suffering. And anyone that responds and intervenes is doing a kind of a mirroring of what God himself has done for the human
Yeah.
race. Of course,
Yeah.
when it comes to healing, we could talk about the fact that we live in a world in which the kingdom of God has broken in decisively, but in which the old way of things, the brokenness is still here for a time. And so if someone is healed, that's a reminder that the kingdom of God has broken in. If someone is not healed, it's not because they didn't have enough faith, not because they're being punished, but because the old way of things is still here for now. But
Yeah.
one day it will be removed entirely.
Yeah, I've just found the suffering of Jesus to be so helpful in answering that question. Am I not healed, or did God not answer those prayers to intervene to save us from these situations because he doesn't love us? And when you see God suffering for us, that's a definitive answer. No, your suffering or the lack of the answer to prayer that you wanted, that is not evidence that God is absent or that he doesn't love you. That's been shown on the cross a long time ago. And I've been
Yeah.
really challenged, I think, in coming to recognize how short my perspective is, how feeble. I think I've got a lot of maybe more skeptical influences and people who've asked questions in the past who are like, well, if you had God's powers, wouldn't you stop in to save that child getting crushed or drowning or just the other horrendous things that happen in some of these disasters? And I say, if I had those powers, yes, I would. But I also don't have the ability to know how every event in this world, in a cause and effect, is going to echo down through the ages. In that great prescient movie, Avengers Infinity Wars and Avengers Endgame, that ability that Doctor Strange has to look through the corridors of time and see the different impact that events and decisions that play in, both natural events and moral agents, and to know how to bring about the right end game by where and how to intervene. Like that's a knowledge that only God has access to. And so, yeah, I've just found that a challenging thought on. I'm not as big as I think I am being able to make these judgments of what God should do and when, because you don't know the ripple effects kind of down the track from that too. So this language of theodicy, the concept of justifying the goodness of God in light of evil, you spell out sort of three major views that have been put forward by Christian thinkers, philosophers, theologians to try and explain natural suffering. The natural law kind of view, where God created it this way, so he created a broken planet, at least in our experience, but for a reason, and explore what that might look like. The notion of a human fall, that God created it good, but that the broken planet is as a result of human sin that brought upon a curse on creation. And then the concept of an angelic fall, where a rebellion of spiritual beings actually wrought chaos on God's creative project. Can we spell those out a little bit and just play with that between us? Because I think people would have all sorts of questions around which seems to fit best, and I'm curious which one you sort of think best. So maybe start with natural law view and just feed into that a bit more, and we can see where it goes.
Definitely. So natural law view, something that Richard Swinburne advocates, talks about how the natural laws in our world are necessary for the sustaining of life and for kind of order in the universe and on Earth, and enable us to exercise and to operate as free agents in the world. So in the ways that I mentioned earlier, that there is stability rather than chaos, so that we can actually be free agents, and that's the means by which we can be free agents in the way that we interact with nature. And I think that this is very helpful in the sense that I think he makes an important point, but I would just say I don't think it's the whole story. I think it's part of the story. And I agree with the premise, but I don't think it's the whole story, which is why I go on to say that actually there are also spiritual explanations for the brokenness, not just natural ones. And so I would, and then the second view being the human fall, that actually the human decision to turn away from God in Eden dragged along with it not just our own morality, introducing moral evil, but also our very biology. We're told that Eve's, pains in childbirth will increase, and that also our relationship with the natural world is broken. That the ground, Adam is told, is now cursed because of his actions. And so this view would say that it all hinges on human rebellion against Almighty God. This is a very central mainstream Christian view, I would say, but the thing that it lacks is an ability to make sense of why there were earthquakes and volcanoes vastly predating the arrival of humans on Earth, and if it all hinges around this human interaction, then how do we make sense of cataclysms before that?
So would you say that this view then fits more naturally with a young Earth interpretation of Genesis and sort of the origins question, whereas it would be more difficult to account for more old Earth or theistic evolution explanations?
I think I'd be hesitant to kind of purely adhere it to a young Earth view, because I think there are people of or different views on the age of the Earth that would put strong emphasis on
Yeah.
the human fall and its role.
Would they say
But
though that the world beyond the borders of Eden was wild and somewhat chaotic, but that humanity would have had a special ability not to be susceptible to the suffering or sickness, or particularly to death and decay that was part of the natural system of things beyond? Or would you think that old Earth interpretations would still be happy with saying, no, it was uh, pure order, natural laws brought about goods, and that there was nothing bad in terms of animal death or something prior to a human fall?
I think you find both of those views
Yeah, okay.
represented
Yeah,
in the scholarship,
yeah,
and yes, and trying to, that, yeah, and I think probably it hinges around kind of how what people think of the third view in some ways, and I don't see these different positions as necessarily mutually exclusive, and I think that
yeah, I
there are
thought that too.
elements be brought in from each of them, because I think where I land, and I think an entirely biblical view, is to say that, look, if you look at Genesis 3, the serpent is in the garden already. The author doesn't say how long he has been there, or how much devastation he's been able to wreak in nature before he got anywhere near humans. I think that's an entirely biblical kind of way to come at things. And of course, a fairly mainstream view as to the origins of evil is around the fall of an angelic being that perhaps dragged with him a whole host of other angelic beings.
Yeah.
And of course, the third view is to say that there was not just a human fall, but a pre-human fall or an angelic fall, um, that somehow brought about corruption in the natural world
Mm.
uh, prior to
So
the arrival of human beings.
So the first view really says that natural evil is just part of the system from the get-go, whereas the second two views say, well, no, it seems to be that at the very least, human experience or human exposure to what we call natural evil is something that is the result of a moral evil. So whether it be angelic or human, but some kind of angelic or human fall, that's what sets off the critical event that now exposes humanity to nature's impact, disease, death, decay, that sort of thing. Is that a fair characterization?
Um, I think so, and yes, and of course that isn't without its problems,
Qualifications, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, because why should some poor bunny? Oh no, that's probably too much, too lightening of it. But why should the
Mm.
whole animal kingdom suffer immediately as a result of a human decision? I mean,
Yeah.
it truly was cataclysmic. I'm not saying it's not true, but I'm just saying there are. It doesn't just attributing it all to a human fall doesn't solve all of your problems
Yeah, and
in terms
animal
of
pain
making
has been a big
why
question
God would.
for. Yeah, like the whole notion of animal pain has been a big concern for certain secular thinkers. Cosmic skeptic Alex O'Connor, who was studying at Oxford while you were there with the Ochre and stuff. He, for him, that's his biggest problem with Christianity is the notion of animal suffering. That here are beings that had nothing to do with any moral culpability for evil, and yet suffer dreadfully in a system of predation. And I know Trent Doherty, as another Christian thinker, is the problem of animal pain. His big tome trying to wrestle with that and the nature of natural suffering. So that's another whole dimension to the question.
Yeah.
But how would you, in your mind, as someone who spent a fair bit of time with this, someone said to you, why does God allow this to happen? What would be the
Yeah.
thing that you lean into as the go-to
So
for
I
an
think,
account?
I mean, before I give a kind of like standard, not standard response, but I think I want to keep coming back to this. If it's true that there is evil that's somehow been woven into the natural world, which
Mm.
I think for me is the most persuasive account of this, then it's happened so far back that for us it's as though it's always been this way. We can't imagine it any differently
Mm.
than it actually is. And yeah, but of course, the difficulty with that is how do you make sense of Genesis, and perhaps the distinction is, as you say, that the world was created good, and that's not the same thing as perfect. Um, but certainly, what we can see is when we look at the Genesis account that death, plant and cell death, is implicit in Genesis 1. You know that there are seed-bearing plants that
Mm.
are created, and by definition, there is death woven into that because plants grow when seeds die and are buried in the soil and give birth to new plants. And so death is not something that is absent from the Genesis account. We also get a hint that animal death need not necessarily be out of the question either, particularly when we look at Romans 5 and we see Paul saying that through Adam, death came to all people, but it doesn't say to all living things,
Mm.
implying that there could have been death there as well.
Mm.
But there are different kinds of death, and there is a difference between the kind of the death of a morally sentient being that should have known better and has deliberately chosen to turn away from their maker
Mm.
versus the death of an animal that is hunting to find food to live. Those are different kinds of thing, um, and so um, yeah, I think that this is it's a big area. It's a
Yeah.
difficult area to make sense of. But Genesis, and also we see in Genesis that pain may well have existed pre-fall
Prior
because
to, yeah, could greatly increase the pains of childbirth. Yeah, and just the
yeah,
purpose of pain is another sort of thing that you brought out in your book. You know, it actually helps us rightly navigate our environment. You know, if you're
yeah,
have no sensitivity to your environment, that actually results, you know, whether it's conditions you're born with
yes,
or a skin condition like leprosy and how that affects your nerves, so that you're no longer able to sense it. They're devastating
yes,
conditions because it leaves you
yes,
open then to incredible harm at the hands of the environment because you
yes,
can't perceive what's happening around you.
yeah,
You know, it's interesting just some of the
yeah,
biblical thoughts on this. You know, like Genesis 3, yes, there is a curse that is either intensified or brought about thorns and thistles and increasing pain and toil. And you've got the language of Romans chapter 8, which speaks about the whole creation groans as in labor pains, waiting for the sons of God to be revealed. And I wonder whether it's through the natural law or either of these falls, but part of why God allows natural disasters or a sense of us being at odds with our environment is that he uses these natural happenings to be a symptom of a much deeper sense of alienation or something not being right between creator and creation. And you know, C.S. Lewis had that line where he says that God whispers through our pleasures and speaks through, or is it whispers through our pleasures and speaks through our conscience, but that he shouts in our pains. That it's sort of his
yes,
megaphone to rouse a deaf world.
yeah.
Do you think that that may be something of what is going on? That, you know, the sense of being at the mercy of nature helps to awaken us to the fact that there is a mortality to our human existence separated from the tree of life, separated from the presence of God, and to maybe reach out and to seek for something greater.
I think that certainly they can do that. And if we look at the pandemic, what did we learn from the pandemic? We learned that life is fragile, and that has caused people to really be asking more questions about what is life actually all about? Why am I
Mm.
here? What is the purpose? If it was all over within a few days, what would I be doing? What would I be believing in? Um, we've also learned that we're highly relational beings and that we need each other, and it's not good for us to be alone. And so I think, you know, on a a level that's come to all of us, the kind of natural disaster that was the COVID-19 pandemic, it has certainly caused us to think more widely. I think I wouldn't want to I slightly struggle with the quote of C.S. Lewis in a way because I see what he's getting at, but I also don't want people to picture a God that is kind of shouting at them when they're at their most vulnerable and kind of
Mm.
struggling and in turmoil and chaos. What we see is a God that, and this also comes back to the animal suffering thing, and not a God that willingly inflicts pain on any creature, whether it is animal or human,
Yeah.
but has ordered us the world to be a certain way, but actually promises to be with us even if our worst nightmares come true. And as you mentioned earlier, the fact that Jesus hasn't just suffered like us,
Mm.
but has suffered for us, that horrendous, brutal death on a Roman cross, has opened up the way for us to come to him wherever we are in the
Mm.
world, whatever our income might be, whatever life is throwing at us, in
Mm.
any time, any situation, because he suffered in that way. He suffered without the comfort and presence of the Father, so that we need never suffer without the comfort and presence of the Father. And for me, that's really the bottom line. That's what it really comes down to, that we're never alone, we're never
Mm.
on our own,
Yeah.
whatever we go through. And we don't have a God that is kind of firing a lightning bolt to teach us a lesson. I
Yeah.
mean, there are goods that can come from suffering, but
Yeah.
sometimes we confuse the good things that come out of it with the reason that it happened. And
Yeah.
sometimes we force a hurting
Totally.
person to find the reason that it happened, when what they need is a hand on their shoulder, they need a meal on their
Yeah.
table, they need a comforting presence. Not someone saying, God's doing this for a reason. Maybe he is, but we'll leave that for them to figure out in
Totally.
their
That's
own
so
time.
helpful for that notion that, those are all of those little aphorisms, he gives and takes away, or there's a reason for this, or God's using this to wake us up to our need. Those are things that only the person who is suffering can come up with. They're not things for those who are watching others suffer to come and do. We're just to mourn with those who mourn, to be the agents of God's love and presence near them. So I so appreciate that. I'm curious, as you were hearing people's stories that were suffering, did that cause you to doubt?
Yeah, when I was reading that question of yours, Dan, and actually, no, it caused me to weep. Um, but in a sense, to think, if they can get through that and still believe in a God who is loving and sovereign and beautiful and kind and compassionate, then I can navigate the things that life throws at me
Mm.
one day at a time.
Mm.
And so I think that I don't know where else I would go as
Yeah.
well. I've been walking with God for more of my life than I haven't been. I did
Mm.
change my beliefs as a 20-year-old. I don't know where else I would go. I don't even, where a more persuasive explanation lies, or where a more comforting person lies. As we said at the beginning, if God doesn't exist, then this is just the way the world is, and
Yeah.
kind of chin up, bear it, get through it. But that doesn't seem to ring true for me, and I don't believe it would, even if I was in the midst of my worst nightmares coming true.
Yeah.
And I trust that God would be with me. And yeah, and Jesus says, in this world you will have trouble.
Mm.
You will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world. And
Mm.
I
Yeah, they're
guess
comforting
I just,
thoughts. Really
yeah.
comforting thoughts,
Thoughts,
and
and also, I hope, realities, that
yeah.
God is the Father of all comfort,
Yeah.
the Father of all compassion, and that's real, and it has to be real.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, and if there's anyone that's sort of watching this and you're in that place of wondering where can you turn in terms of your suffering, that's an invitation that Jesus gives to come to him, to find rest and hope. and meaning. It's interesting. Like my experience of being a Christian, having to process these questions of suffering at a whole lot of levels, whether pastoral levels and dimensions of doubt and struggle, philosophical levels of explanation and accounting. How do you reconcile God with these things? There are so many reasons, a couple of dozen or so philosophical arguments for God's existence, a number of which I find reasonably persuasive on a personal level. And this area of the problem of evil and sort of the sub-problem of divine hiddenness, they're the only two in the other camp, the only two that sort of lead to the maybe evidence against God's existence, or at least somewhere on the fence, or a struggle to have to be able to wrestle with. And I think where I get left in these is the Christian story offers resources to help us explain some potential ways to account for the reality of evil and suffering in the world, but it doesn't answer all of the why questions. And it may answer some on a big scale, but it certainly doesn't tell me why God didn't answer this prayer, or why he did allow the car accident with my mum to happen. And so it's the minutiae. There's a whole lot of uncertainty. And you just find that in the Christian story. You read through the book of Job and he never gets an answer. God, why did you let that happen? There's no forthcoming explanation. Even when God turns up and gives it to him, it's just having to wrestle with the bigness of God, who knows more than he does, and then repenting in dust and ashes. Or speaking with Chris Wright, someone I've looked up to for a long time, sort of an Old Testament theologian and thinker on mission over at the Langham Partnership. He spoke last week just about the tremendous gift that lament gives to us in the scriptures as a way of being able to express uncertainty while still holding on to the goodness of God. I'm curious, just practically, as someone who's wandered through this in your own personal life a whole lot of different times, how do you do that? How have you held on to the goodness of God even while you're expressing uncertainty and frustration? Is there some way that you've managed to navigate through that?
I think that the Psalms are a place that I go to, and there we see all kinds of emotions being expressed, and at different times within the same psalm and in different psalms, and of course they're from different people. But what we see is them being very real with God and not seeing that they need to sugarcoat their prayers. And there was a time that God actually said to me, I want you. I don't want your polite potted prayers. I actually want you. And that's something I keep coming back to, that we are invited, we can be real with God. We've got this social media now that's called Be Real, and actually at the heart, that is what the Christian faith offers, that you can be real about yourself, about life, about God, but acknowledging that, be real about who God is in the mix of that as well, that he is a God who promises to hear our prayers and answer them, not necessarily in the ways that we expect, but he does hear and he does respond. Um, and so the Psalms are a place that I go to. And also, again, I mean, there are very helpful resources on unanswered prayer out there. God on Mute by Pete Greig, and there's also a course that goes with that. And a reminder from Pete's book that Jesus knew what it was himself to experience unanswered prayer. When we're just coming towards Easter, when he was in Gethsemane the night before he died, he asked, Father, if this is possible, take this cup away from me. But not my will, but yours be done. He knew what it was to actually pray prayers that were not answered in the way that he would hope. And that just blows my mind,
Totally.
But this is the kind of God that we can come to, not one who is aloof or doesn't quite get it. He actually knows what it's like to live on this earth and wrestle with the things that we wrestle with, and promises never to leave us or forsake us.
And that the value too that the Christian story offers in the concept of death not being the full stop in the sentence of reality, but the notion that there can be an afterlife, there can be a resurrection into a body that cannot die, a world to come in the new heavens and new earth where God comes to be with us, a place of no more suffering or sickness or crying or death or pain, where the very real tears of this world are wiped away. That notion of God's ability to restore and to redeem in eternity what seems lost here is just such a
Yeah.
tremendous gift. And even in that story of Job, where there was the promise that God restored twofold what was lost to him in the tragedies that befell him in the beginning of the story, but only ever receiving back the same number of children that were lost, and the whole implication that he still has the others, just not here. And the
Yeah.
potential that there is that reunification of coming back together with lost loved ones in God's presence in the world to come. And just the hope that is imbued into those that are suffering in light of that. It's a tremendous gift. And it's not pie in the sky when you die, the heavenly minded, no earthly good. It animates you to live differently through your suffering here.
Yeah.
And that's why I think I've so admired those who have waded into the suffering of others in response to the Christian story, knowing that God loves them and wants us to be able to be there. And maybe if there's some closing advice that you might give, often I talk to people who ask this question on behalf of someone that they know. Their friend is dying of cancer, or a family member is sick and needs a transplant, or someone's been hurt in a car accident. And they're like, how do I help? What do I do? What's the right thing you'd encourage people to do in situations where they come alongside those who are suffering?
Well, I come back to the book of Job that you've already mentioned, and that his friends go quickly to him and they spend time in silence with him initially. I think that there's something in that before it all goes pear shaped and they begin to open their mouths and it all goes wrong. I would say that um, that we to be there for our friends, and many we know this instinctively, and we do this already. That to be present with a hurting person actually speaks volumes. Just to be present, to listen, to be prepared to say nothing, and to because there are some times that words cannot capture the profundity of a person's pain.
Mm.
And as soon as you start to use words, you've lost something. There's something about silence that really kind of captures the depths of agony.
Mm.
So be prepared not to say anything,
Yeah.
and then to pray, but to pray sensitively and carefully,
Mm.
and to help practically. And often that's the thing that we are best at, that we can offer practical help. Sometimes we don't know whether to talk to the person about their pain, and that feels like the elephant in the room, but meals or childcare or just coming round and watching a movie so that they're not on their own, or
Yeah.
things like this can help get a person through a very, very dark valley. And that there are studies out there, aren't there, slightly trite, about people holding their hands in cold water and things like that. That you can do this for much, much longer if there are other people with you, helping you to get through it. And it's no different in times of pain.
Or for a
And
trivial
being
example,
quick to listen.
my running in the morning, having someone with me helps me get through the pain and keep going. All right, so be there, shut up, pray sensitively, and serve practically. Is sort of a little mini summary of what you say. The shut up being maybe the most important there, so that we don't
and
stamp
that,
our feet
and maybe
unhelpfully. Yeah.
and be prepared to bring them to Jesus. There will be needs that our friends have that we cannot meet and will never be able to meet, but that God can. We
Yeah.
carry our friends to Jesus, the God of all comfort and the Father of all compassion.
No, that's super helpful. Hey, Sharon, thanks so much for coming in and just talking about your book, Broken Planet. Thanks so much for spending time researching and painstakingly transcribing stories and then piecing together so many different parts of a response to it. That just helps us think through layers of a complex question. Really appreciate it. If people want to get a copy of that book or find any of your other work, where would you recommend they go?
Probably the easiest place would be Amazon at the moment. I'm just building my own website, so look out for that in the next couple of months. But until then, probably Amazon.
Great.
would be a good place.
Well, we'll put links in the show notes to the book on Amazon, as well as to your previous book, Am I Just My Brain? Mainly because not everyone is able to spell your surname Dirks on the first attempt, and so we want to make sure that they don't miss that the opportunity to grab that. But Sharon, if you had a parting message just to maybe anyone who's listening to this and exploring Jesus, why would you say the Christian story and following Jesus is worth it?
It hinges for me on whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. If he rose from the dead, then there's more than we can see with our eyes. And it's not simply true for certain people and not others. It's either true for all of us or not, none of us. I became convinced that Jesus truly rose from the dead and is not in a grave today, but he is alive. And his desire is that all people would come to know him. Nobody is excluded. Nobody is outside of the boundaries of God's love. So I just invite you to ask your questions, find other people who call themselves Christians, ask them their questions are yours. And God loves you and would long for you to come to him. So why not ask him, if he's real, to make himself known to you today.
Oh, thanks. Super helpful. And Sharon, I'll put the link as well in the show notes to the phenomenal conversation you had with Justin Brierley, sort of interacting with Ian McGilchrist on the concept of our brains and different explanations for our experience of consciousness. And it was wonderful. So we'll make sure that people can get access to that as well so they can follow you and find you. Well, thanks so much for coming on. I can't wait till we get you back next time on another big topic.
Thank you, Dan.
Pleasure. Well, thanks so much for watching to the very end. If you want to get more of this helpful content from Questioning Christianity, please do subscribe and click the notification bell on YouTube, and then go over to our social media accounts, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, all of those places. It's at QC Socials, and you'll find us there with a ton of other content exploring short answers to tough questions, 5 to 10 minute videos, about 60 of those nowadays, exploring a whole range of other questions that you might have, infographics, ideas, and big conversations that are coming up for us as well in the future. It's been great to see you. Until next time, truth invites questioning. See ya. Dan here from Questioning Christianity. Thanks so much for checking us out. We are all about helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. So if you're enjoying the content, make sure you subscribe and click the bell on YouTube, and then go ahead and follow us on socials.